Without any further ado, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce a local international star, not Formula One, but we call it GELS in Canada, or ELSI in North America. And Bartha really has been a thought leader for many years now, not just answering questions, but telling us what questions we should be thinking about and discussing as a community. So very, very pleased to have Bartha come and speak to us and let us know what we should be thinking about these days.
Bonjour, good afternoon. I think John forgot to mention that in terms of competition, there's also the Mondial de la Bière just one floor below us.
This is water, though.
Yeah, that's water, yes. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is bring a completely different perspective to the involvement of individuals in research. And I've called it activating the right of citizens to benefit from scientific advances. So it's actually a right that belongs to citizens. And this challenge of how to do this, I think this conference really epitomizes where we're going in terms of not only the amount of data that we need, the amount of involvement from citizens, healthy, susceptible, ill, or not, whole populations and so on, to get the amount of data that we need before we can get to personalized medicine. Because we sort of jump right away from populations and population studies and biobanks that have been here for a decade now and presume we can just move to personalized medicine. Whereas in fact we need to stratify, we need to move to subpopulations. And then within those subpopulations be able to personalize and precision medicine. What's interesting about subpopulations is that you'll be regrouped into different ones. In other words, you could be in one for susceptibility to early onset something, you could be resistant to other conditions, you could be probabilistic at high risk or low risk for other things. In other words, the traditional categories that we have in law that talk about discrimination based on age or gender or race or ancestry and so on will probably be blown apart by the fact that your potential for being discriminated against based on genetic information will be as probabilistic as the information itself. And this is going to have a long-term impact on the traditional insurance fears, employment fears, stigmatization fears, and so on. Because the more we end up in different subpopulations that presume different levels of risk, the more there will be equivalency in risk. So I just mentioned the millions of samples that will be needed, and you're going to be seeing a few slides on the Global Alliance before I actually get to the human right to science, as it's called. And I know that David, who's following me, was one of the first chair of the Global Alliance, and it's really being part of this sort of scary or pioneer activity that led to the search for a different approach, a different GELS approach to science. So here you just have the most recent statistics in terms of organizations and countries. If you add the individual members in, you'll see there's over 71 countries, and there's another 700 or something individual members. But look at the breakdown here. You don't have your traditional university academia-laden type of organization. The Global Alliance has universities and researchers and so on, but it also has IT, it has advocacy groups, academic centers, and so on. So the working group, there's 4 of them that I co-chair with Kazuto Kato from Japan, is a regulatory and ethics working group. So most of my presentation will concentrate on some of the efforts of this group to build the Global Alliance. So what is it? Well, the mission of the Global Alliance is to accelerate, if you like, data-intensive science on a global scale. So it's really to move it forward. There's no particular drug, product, test, or anything that's foreseen. It's really an effort to collectively enable the responsible sharing of genomic, clinical, environmental, and other data. So it convenes, it catalyzes, it creates, it acts as a clearinghouse, it fosters innovation, and so on. It's not organized. It's not even legally incorporated. It is organized. Sorry, Peter. I mean, it's not legally incorporated. I'm going to get into trouble. So it's an epigenetic dynamic, how's that, bottoms-up effort, and committed to responsible data sharing. What it is not doing is storing data. So it's not a mega project. It doesn't do research per se as an alliance. It doesn't interpret genomes, and it doesn't say you must share data to be a member. The only condition of membership in the Global Alliance is that you agree to its framework, the framework for responsible sharing of genomic and health-related data. So the overall approach then is to internationally ensure interoperability, to allow for harmonization of approaches and to sharing data, and while respecting autonomy of participants. So it's really an engagement exercise, and it's actually quite involving, to say the least. I won't talk about these demonstration projects. I'm sure Peter Goodhand, who's the executive director tomorrow, will, or perhaps even David, but there's different demonstration projects as well that actually demonstrate that this can be done, that you can have a beacon that says, bing, is there anyone in the world that has an allele or whatever of this, a matchmaker exchange for rare diseases. That's not a traditional television kind of matchmaking, but matchmaking between people with rare diseases, and the BRCA challenge, which is trying to create a variant reference base, better, higher quality, and open in access in comparison to Myriad. So let's get down to why we decided to take a different approach, an international human rights approach, not your traditional bioethics with a usual list of principles and so on. So why did we take this international approach, and what does it mean? Well, first of all, it's based on a neglected, very well hidden, but it's been around for a long time, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It actually has in Article 27 an article that states that everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And in that same article, for you scientists in the room, it has a second part which is all about the fact that you also have the right to proper attribution and recognition for your intellectual and innovative ideas. So it says, yes, citizens have a right to benefit, so get on with it, give it to the citizens. At the same time, you will be recognized for your work. This right has been largely dormant, unstudied, unexploited, unused. Then, in 1966, there was an international covenant on social and economic rights, and in this covenant, the exact same wording, almost, entered into Article 15, and you'll see the rights to benefits of scientific progress and its applications. And then you have scientific freedom and so on. This time, however, contrary to a declaration, which is an aspirational document, it was signed and ratified by 164 countries. And if something is signed and ratified, that means legally in your own country, in your home country, it has legal force in domestic law, which means you can call upon this international instrument to reinforce the interpretation or the actionability, if you like, of domestic legislation. So it's there. And what makes it interesting is that this ratification with the 164 countries that have signed creates an obligation on countries to report what they have done under every article of that covenant. So governments are called to report to a committee at the UN on what have they done to respect their obligations under this covenant. So why a human rights approach as to your traditional bioethics kind of approach? Well, The literature had already started looking at the potential of human rights. An author that's well known who writes a lot about human dignity, Adorno, he saw it as a globalized public health approach, and that this could be, like dignity is the foundation for bioethics, it could also be the foundation then, and is the foundation for human rights. And we know in the bioethics community about the discussions, in quotes, around Western ethics, Asian ethics, and so on, and the divergence based on different cultural approaches to interpretations of bioethics. Human rights are universal, and they are universally recognized across all countries. Now, it's already in international law, and it also applies to groups, not just individuals. And a lot of bioethics declarations talk about protection from harm. They begin almost with a negative presumption against research, and that researchers have to go to their IRB and convince them that they're not going to harm someone. So this is totally turning things. Someone told me that this was disruptive. They said, what are you doing with this disruptive approach? We're starting from the fact that if there is a right to benefit, then research should be seen as a positive endeavor in society, and that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be framed, or that citizens don't need to be protected, but that the goal should be to let them benefit from it and be accountable for their work. So in another article, again, they say that this approach goes beyond the ethical responsibilities of individuals, and it creates responsibilities on governments. And I think that's the political legal actionability of the human rights approach that might allow us to turn around what I call the Nuremberg mentality, still very much pervasive in modern research involving humans. The human rights approach also brings in all the other rights, the privacy rights, the non-discrimination rights, and so on. And it's more societal, if you like, than going directly to the individual project or the individual participant or researcher. And so it will shift the focus to a collective responsibility for health. And then finally, this is from Eric Meslin, in a biobank context. He says, whereas public health practice adopts collectivist principles that emphasize utilitarian and population-based benefits, genomic and especially personalized medicine is squarely grounded in individualist ethic that emphasizes autonomous decision-making for personal benefits, creating different ethical priorities. The gap between these two can best be bridged through a human rights approach. So the literature is beginning to see the possible benefits of switching to this kind of framework. So what is the contents? This is the shorthand for this is called the right to science. But it wasn't until 2009 that UNESCO, in the Venice Statement, actually began to study and think about what this right to science would mean. So, without access, without discrimination, opportunities to contribute, scientific freedom, participation, and diffusion of science and technology are what the UNESCO Venice Statement includes. The AAAS is picking up on this, and they've actually now also have, if you go to their website, a whole right to science section where they are beginning to collect instruments that recognize this right. So they're trying to sensitize the scientific community to this new approach. And then the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. So what we did at the very beginning of the Alliance, which is only, 3 years ago, I think, right, David? Is we decided to create this framework. This is the framework that you need to agree with to be a member. And the framework itself wants to be both principled and practical. So the aims are there, they're almost self-evident, and don't forget, what we are looking at here is data-intensive science. By and large, the Global Alliance, the framework, the policies, the tools, and everything are not looking at clinical trials. And a lot of the bioethics frameworks are really there with clinical trials in mind, intrusive drugs, devices, and so on, with a physiological harms. So here are the aims, and I have to say, the foundational principles that you see at the bottom that look self-evident were the basis of more discussion than other than consent, which I'll get to in a minute, than I've ever seen in an international forum. Because people wanted to make lists. So take the first one. Respect individuals, families, and communities. Well, someone said, don't you think we should put cultural entities? Shouldn't we put disabled community? Shouldn't we put minorities? Shouldn't we? And the longer the list grew, the more people could find things that were missing from the list or needed to add to the list. So what we finally decided to do, because if there's a list, you're going to end up, concentrating on one part, is to regroup it into individuals, families, and communities. And where you are in the world, you can put in there what you see in there without it having to be a long, lengthy list. So we're sort of the art and science of policy making. These are the core elements. You'll note that they are data-specific, data-sharing-specific core elements. So you don't see your usual autonomy, privacy, justice, beneficence, and so on kind of list that characterize bioethics statements. And there's no particular hierarchy or order in these core elements. We are up to, as just got a volunteer yesterday from Korea, we have English, 12 other languages, and Korean will be coming hopefully in a few months. Anyone in the audience who speaks and writes a language or knows a language and wants to translate the framework and find a validator, a legal validator, these are all available. The whole framework is available in these languages, so we're going up to 14, probably in about 2 months. When we first met, not the original meeting, but the first open sort of meeting, everyone said, oh, give us clauses. We don't have international data sharing in our consents. What do we do? How do we have to reconsent, 10,000 people in order to start working with the Global Alliance? And so the generic consent clauses and the consent policy, which I'll get to in a minute, and so on, all of these policies are meant to provide guidance. And just like in the framework itself, every one of those aims has 3 procedural tools. So it'll say what the aim is, and then it'll give 3 directions, if you like, guidance. So it's not just a list of a wish list. It actually says how you can carry this forward. And similarly, the policies and any other tools have that same aim. Probably the most used part of the consent policies, not just the clauses, the generic clauses that are up on the database, on the website, I should say, but the legacy data issue. What do you do for consents with materials and data from 2003? And how can you use them? How can you not waste the energy and the altruism of the data and samples that were offered? And there's guidance provided in the consent policy. Another unique feature is in the privacy and security policy, because the main goal of this document was to say, rather than presume that everything is a privacy risk and that confidentiality is going to be breached. By the way, a recent study in the UK has not found one documented, validated, authenticated breach of research data. So we wanted to take a proportionate approach. What are the real, not the hypothetical risks, not the hacker, one day, what if somewhere someone does something that could lead to something? What are the real risks and what are the real benefits? And balance in a proportionate way. And as you will see in the next one, which is the accountability policy, if someone has consented to sharing and you have their data and their samples, why are you not sharing? So accountability is not just your typical sort of answering for according to what you said you should do in being secure, being private, keeping confidential and so on, but also why aren't you sharing? Why are you sitting on your data and samples? It includes funders, it includes researchers, publishers and so on, all in this accountability policy. The most recent tool is the data sharing lexicon. 13 lawyers. I don't think it's an experience I want to go through again. Luckily, I wasn't chairing this data sharing lexicon discussion. So never mind the legal people and how we are obsessed with words. There was a problem of interoperability or whatever of language. Because de-identification, to me, is a verb. But in the United States, it has to do with meeting the rules under HIPAA for 18 attributes that you must remove before you can use the data, which is akin to anonymization, which is not the same as pseudo-anonymization under the new data regulation that just came in Europe. So when you receive a consent form that says, I agree that my de-identified data can be shared, we don't know what it means. And Canada has another one. So we tried in this lexicon, by going through all the consent forms to different countries, different jurisdictions, to come to some sort of concordance of common understanding. So if you have a data transfer agreement and you say, we are using the terms as defined in the lexicon, that's one line, that's all you have to do, not 20 pages of explaining what these terms mean. And each term is only about maximum 2 sentences. So again, this is a wonderful, hopefully, tool for data sharing. Consent codes, this was a fun one as well. There are sort of standardized restrictions depending on the nature of the research that you'll find across the board, across countries, across documents and so on, across policies and laws. If we could code them very simply, and so by virtue of attaching these codes to the data and samples, you would automatically know, very simply, what you can or cannot do. You don't have to read all the consent forms, and this has just been published in PLOS Genetics. This is a 10-year project, at least. Can you get ethics committees, not only within Canada across provinces, or between Canada and the United States, how about Brazil, Germany, and Iceland, in an international project with, let's say, 17 countries, these are becoming more and more sort of the norm, to say, I recognize your ethics review process, the way you do it. Because basically, even if you call it different things and it's centralized as opposed to this or that or local, you are following substantively the same procedural safeguards for ethics review. So this group is trying to look at different models, reciprocal, I'm okay, you're okay kind of model, delegate, okay, you're the lead, you take it, we'll all look at it, give you comments, but we'll follow whatever your IRB decides. Or federated, let's just all, sort of the Canadian approach, of course, and sort of all be equal and all decide together, which ends up being quite cumbersome, as you can imagine. And moving forward to do this internationally in a way that people will say, if you have these attributes and this review process, we'll go with whatever the Brazil IRB decides. Similarly for safe havens, where is it safe to store data? What does it mean that dbGaP is safe or EGA is safe? And how can we define what a safe haven is and put one line into the IRB, say, so-and-so, a recognized safe haven is where we are putting our data. And last, and I'll conclude with that to have some time for questions, there's controlled access, which is your DACOs and you're protecting vulnerable groups, children, sensitive data, and so on. And then you've got your open, like HapMap, like the 1,000 Genomes Project, and so on. But somewhere in between for data intensive, that has nothing to do with clinical trials, where there are not vulnerable populations involved, can't we have a simplified system with the minimum amount of authentication that you really are who you are and where you say you are from where you come from, and then simply register and self-declare that you will meet certain obligations, all online, no DACOs, and go ahead and get on with your project rather than spending a year trying to get clearance. So these are the different task teams. All the working groups have task teams, all working on subjects, some of them probably of interest to you. Anyone's welcome to join a task team and get to work. And finally, I should mention that Genome Canada, Genome Quebec, Genome BC, and Genome Ontario have just sponsored a project called CanShare, which is going to support the policy work of the Global Alliance. It's really exciting. We need tons of volunteers. You never know what's going to come up as a challenge, or someone says, I've got an idea, I need a task team. So it really is a lively way, very participatory way of doing science. So I encourage you to participate. I think what's important to remember is that, that the framework then is built on this sharing principle. And I think the only way to realize it is to make sure also that scientists are recognized. And fundamentally, what I found so far, and it's only been 3 years, it's a tremendous learning experience, sort of like doing an eternal postdoc. So there's also, it's not just committees and task teams, it's actually responding proactively in an anticipatory governance way to new challenges. So they talk about, standing on the shoulders of giants, but if you look at this very closely, if you can see it from where you're seated, you'll see that really is an alliance of individuals working together, and that does truly make it global. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, Bartha. We have some time for a couple of questions. If you come to the central microphone. We have time for a couple, so don't be shy.
Thank you very much, Bartha. It's a beautiful introduction to the Congress. How would you reconcile this data sharing, which I think most of the scientists would agree to, with data protection, which sometimes the governance of the countries is feeling responsible for to protect the data from sharing? Mm-hmm. More than encouraged sharing.
I think, and I'm sure you'll be happy to hear this, you could blame some of that on the lawyers. Secondly, I think it's an outdated and unsubstantiated approach. There is no proof of harm from that we've been able to find, and it was the FAR, our institute in the UK, that did the study on documented data breaches in the research. We know about, the doctor who leaves the laptop in the trunk of the car or whatever. That's different. In the research setting, I think this protectionist thing is extremely paternalistic. And when patients find out about this, they actually get quite upset that their data and samples have not been used and they're being protected from hypothetical harms.
Thank you.
Thank you for your excellent talk. I'm a clinical scientist, and I suffer from that, as you call it, the Nuremberg, what shall we call it, the Nuremberg effects. And that is really a shackle on a lot of the clinical research we do. I really appreciate this, but how do you think it's really going to percolate down or up or however to the IRBs? Because it seems to me that there's a mindset exactly, and do you think it's really going to come from top, from the government? And the second question I have, are there all the commercial interests, and especially as clinical research now is beginning to be overtaken, at least in the cancer field, by the pharmaceutical industry, to what extent are they going to be able to be held to accountability with these standards?
Sure. I think we need to re-examine the curricula of formal bioethics training. I think a lot of it is still based on the sort of guardians of the safety and health, whereas it should be the researchers as well, but it should also be more, what are the governance mechanisms in place, what are the checks and balances at every step, rather than an upfront barrier. Like, how can we manage risk rather than how can we avoid a risk? And to your second question, I think you'll see in the pharmaceutical companies coming around, it started with the Human Genome Project in the preemptive, pre-competitive data sharing that actually was part of the mapping of the human genome. They were in there because if at that level of basic data that everyone needs, why not just everyone contribute? Because once you get that basic data, then you can go back to your legitimate competitiveness, which you're supposed to do by law, and you owe it to your shareholders. But that doesn't prevent pharma, one, from participating in variant database creation, for instance, sponsoring not only educational initiatives, but the sharing of clinical data post success or failure in an open access way, like clinicaltrial.com does. So I think we're seeing movement. We know some of that's coming from the EMA and the FDA pushing pharma in that direction. But I also think they're beginning to understand the benefits of participating in the data sharing initiatives.
One last question, thank you.
Hi. David Levine, thank you very much for the presentation. My concern is how do we get the population to feel comfortable with this particular issue? We're inundated with giving our data out. Companies like Netflix certainly must have a psychological profile on me by the films I choose to watch. They suggest what I should watch on a regular basis and can use that information to many, many companies, and that's psychological data coming out of what I watch or the books I buy. Population doesn't seem to mind that at all and allow it to happen. The media doesn't seem to mind that at all. Why is there so much concern here, and how do we get around that concern in the public?
Yeah, we could add Facebook to your list of not being concerned of putting it all out there. I think that we're in a contradiction. Somehow, anything that's genetic or medical is seen as super sensitive. And why is it just like normal information? How do we normalize medical information? If you look 50 years ago, psychiatric information was in that category. It's now, people talk about mental illness and so on. They talk about reproductive issues. So it could be sort of a time warp between what's considered sensitive, and I think that's definitely moving away. And companies such as Amazon and so on, they can change their service agreement clauses. They'll just tell you, no, this is standard, the whole world accepts this. You can negotiate with IT companies when you have issues about sharing data between countries with different levels of protection. So it's a long road, but I do think that this generation is much more open about sharing personal. To me, it's just personal data.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time for another question if we want to keep on track. I would like to obviously ask everybody to give a big round of applause for Dr. Bartha Knoppers for her very thoughtful presentation.